Hello, this is Mark Mitchell, and I just wanted to record a short video here on Chapter 1 to let you know some of the things that I thought were important and hopefully will help you in the chapter. Alright, but we're starting off here in Chapter 1 in the book, Sociology in a Changing World. And this next slide really tells you the main points of the chapter. That our book is divided into these different sections that you see here on this slide. And it really kind of should help you know what to focus on. After reading the chapter, you should have an answer to these questions here that you see. So, for example, what is sociology and some of the history? And we'll go through some of these a little bit more today for a few moments, all the way to the end. Our book does have some other examples, and that's what it means by the box features. So here in Chapter 1, there's just 3 additional articles there to read that they provide that help to explain some of the topics that are in the chapter. Let's start out today by looking at what sociology is. So if you've ever had a psychology course, you realize that was about behavior of the individual. Well, sociology is also about behavior, but it's about the behavior of groups of people. And our book has a definition that really emphasizes some important parts. And one, the systematic study. So that's our scientific method, really, that we're going to incorporate. And then it does mention individuals and society. So there's a couple important parts right there that are mentioned. The sociological perspective is looking at things in a different way. We're going to try to look at it maybe from the standpoint of someone else, or kind of like with rose-colored glasses. I know that's a modern term, but that phrase goes back quite a while, but it just means how we are trying to see things differently than before, and usually that means out of our own perspective and into someone else's. Now, the background for sociology, with this slide you can see the historical and social context. They are trying to show us there were several changes that really made it right for sociology to develop as a science. And they start out by telling us, really part of that comes in by modernity. And here they're just simply telling us that people started looking at the world a little bit differently than had been true prior to this time. So, it's only been within the last 250 to 300 years that this has occurred. Science began to be used, and so before this, what did people do? But they really relied on other things. And for example, some of the coming charts, we'll see that religion was something that really kind of had a great emphasis on the world and how people thought about it. But now they were moving to something else. It was really something empirical that you could base your senses on, your 5 senses on. And so that's why our book is mentioning this as a cultural revolution. Science and the Enlightenment paved the way for sociology, but also some of the other social sciences as well. People began to be concerned with their own personal rights and freedoms, and so that's the political revolution that our book mentions. And also some other things that happened that were very important in sociology's history was economic and social revolutions, primarily the Industrial Revolution, where productivity just really ramped up, and that was how machines were used to really make just so much more. That's the productivity part of it. And then urbanization. Before that, people lived on farms. They lived primarily isolated lives. Just the vast majority of people lived that way, but now they were coming to cities where factories were located, and that's how cities began to grow and get large and big as people worked there, and they had moved from the farms, and that led to further changes. Now we see here just a table that summarizes all those things in one chart. Instead of having the last few to look at, we can do it this way, but it just mentions some of those things we've talked about. Now, sociological thought is our next topic that comes up in the book, and so it does mention several important individuals in the beginnings of sociology. So Auguste Comte is one, and so he is often referred to as the father of sociology, and he was one that would definitely agree with the scientific method. That's illustrated in the comment of positivism under his name. And then he would also be a believer in what we'll see later as the structural functional theory or perspective that is later in the chapter, and we'll see in the remaining of the textbook throughout the semester. Herbert Spencer is an interesting person, but you can see here he's listed also. But he is one who believed in basically survival of the fittest. And so, he would say the strong would survive and the weak would die out. And that's, really kind of a controversial idea in some ways today because of all the social programs that are available to help, in effect, some that might be classified under Spencer's ideas as weak compared to those who maybe don't receive the help. And so his ideas are, start there, but would be very interesting to look at. But maybe today we would call that social Darwinism that I mentioned earlier related to Spencer and some of his personal beliefs. Some other key thinkers here in sociology, and I think most sociology books really have a lot on Karl Marx, and so he is going to be important for what we'll see as the social conflict paradigm. And he has much to say about a system that he really did not like because he thought it produced a lot of suffering for people, but that was capitalism. Emile Durkheim, we will see quite a bit pop up in different chapters because he was just a prolific researcher. He started out with a religious background, but really turned his back on that. But he is probably most known in sociology textbooks for his suicide study, which on page 11 in the text, if you there's one of those extra articles, but he talks about the types of suicide there are. So most books mention his suicide study, but ours goes a little bit beyond that and talks about the 4 types of suicide. So egoistic, altruistic, anomic, and fatalistic are those 4 types. And that, again, page 11 gives a little bit better description. But Durkheim also mentions some of the other things here on the chart, the social solidarity, the division of labor or the specialty of jobs that people have, the collective conscience, meaning what people agree on in values of society, such as good or bad, and maybe topics like abusing children, most people would see as bad, or things similar to that, whether they are good or bad. And then anome, that ties back into this feeling of loss, where people just don't feel connected anymore to others or standards or anything, and that ties back into a suicide study. Finally, Max Weber. In this section, he is, again, one of those pioneers along with Marx and Durkheim, but he was really emphasizing about how people act rationally. They may have calculations behind their decisions, what benefits them. And that certainly makes a lot of sense. But one of the articles that he wrote over 100 years ago that people still read and refer to today is The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And I think in a way our slide here refers to it and the next one gets into it. But it's a lengthy article. It's difficult to read. Need definitely a dictionary or access to an online dictionary when you read it if you'd like to. But he really talks about how 2 opposite things work together to produce something known as capitalism. And so religion there, believe it or not, he in his article he shows how some of the beliefs of religion and the practicing of it led to what we know today as capitalism. That took a great long time for that to happen, but it really is a good article that he wrote. Again, here's a summary slide of things we've been talking about. So gives you a picture of what these gentlemen look like. And, of course, they lived in a time in which white males did dominate a lot of academic disciplines, not only sociology, but that's one of the things they have in common. Now, I mentioned that because our next slide just shows some differences. We're starting to see some contributions from other groups of people, which it's always been that way. It's just now they're finally recognized. But W.E. Du Bois was an African-American Harriet Martineau, of course, was a woman. Jane Addams was a woman, but also shows you a little bit of some of their research interest in their work in life and what they studied at a time in which it was very hard to do so, and they just didn't receive the same type of recognition as some of the other people that we've mentioned, at least in obtaining their degrees from institutions that they attended. All right, there's a summary chart as well. But Harriet Martineau, for example, she helped translate some of Comte's works to other audiences so they could read it. W.E. Du Bois was interested in race and the problems that may happen between the races and racial conflict, and Jane Addams was about helping newly immigrants to the country there, so you may remember her from the Whole House, but some good examples there of different contributions. There's a lot of theories in sociology. I'm sure you're familiar with some of them already, especially if you've taken a psychology course or some other course along those lines. But the idea of a theory is it's an idea of how the world works, and it's not yet tested. When it takes that tested form, it's a hypothesis, but we'll talk about that some more in Chapter 2. So there may be plenty of theories in the book, but you're free to like them or not like them. That's certainly fine either way, but they do help from the standpoint that they give us some ideas to think about. And a lot of these theories that are mentioned in our book, they do sound really good. So it's not just something that somebody came up with in a flash. It's something they devoted a lot of time for. And again, with how old some of these are, the reason they are still talked about today is at least they help some people to explain lots of phenomena that are out there. Now, our book tries to give us a little bit of more explanation about some of these different theories that we're going to see, and just the way that our book presents it, there's just important dimensions of the theory, and that's what you see on the slide. For example, a lot of the theories deal with consensus and conflict, whether people agree or disagree, whether it's material things or if it's things that people think about. That's the objective versus subjective. And then the micro level and macro just means the level of analysis in which we're going to look at it, from very small to very large or somewhere in between. The meso would be in between. But you can look at some of these theories and then start to break them down in terms of these key dimensions, as the way our text refers to it. All right, so here's those key dimensions again, and trying to define it. I did that earlier, but it's here on this slide. Okay, so one of our big theories, and let me go back up. It's a major goal of the course is the structural functional theory or perspective. You just see it different ways, but it just says here, now there's some videos in our Blackboard course shell that I encourage everybody to watch. It takes a little bit of time to get used to these. There'll be questions on the exam and quizzes that ask you to be able to pick out which of these perspectives or theories are being used. And I think the more experience you have with it, the easier it'll become. So I also have a video on the quizzes and exams, and I think I got a few examples there that should help. But the structural functional theory is just really comparing things to a human organism. It's saying these theories explain just about anything you can look at because they have a certain structure, whether that's tangible or intangible, and that structure provides a function. It leads to a goal. So, for example, with school, school certainly has a structure in terms of when it meets and how long, and so on and so on. But what is the goal, the function of school? And it is education. So no matter what it is, you would follow a similar pattern just like that. But the structural functionalist would argue that, just like your body is a collection of organs that work together, society is like that too. Your body has a structure. It's composed of organs, of bones, of muscles, and so on and so on. And the goal of all these organs and muscles is for somebody to live. but that's how you're going to break at things. And so manifest is the intended purpose. If you go back to school, that's education, but some of the hidden functions would be maybe people find a dating partner or their spouse, and this dysfunctional would be maybe fights at school or things like that. But that's a quick look at our first major theory. Karl Marx is really one of the biggest individuals we could list for the conflict theories or social conflict theories, and so really it does look at power and inequality. That's a theme in our book, but it says that that's really why you have conflict in societies. You have two sides that are going back and forth about some type of valued resource. Now, you can also put feminist theories in that same bracket, so to speak, because here it's not just maybe race or class that's being discussed, but gender and sex. So, who has more power, men or women? Who has more material resources or wealth? Is it men or women? So that's what feminist theory would argue. And it really says is that women come up on the short end, and a feminist is nothing more than a person who wants this inequality to be gone. Finally, our third theory is the symbolic interaction. So, really calls into question what is a symbol, but it's something that represents something else. An interaction, of course, is the back and forth flow between at least two people or maybe more that makes, life interesting. Usually it's oral, but it can be nonverbal and things of that nature. We see it in advertising all the time, but people trying to create sustained meaning, and that's what's going on in symbolic interaction. So we can see, again, different sociologists who are related to each of these. Irving Goffman is one that's mentioned for symbolic interaction, Karl Marx for social conflict, and Auguste Comte for structural functional, or Emile Durkheim are some good examples. Now, also, our book tries to relate to the theories, these three items you see here on the next slide, but culture, which we'll have a different chapter on entirely, but just a way of life is one of the ways I would define it in a very short way. We have structure, which that goes back to our structural functional perspective or hypothesis, but it's just repeatable patterns that you're going to be able to see in life, whether they're tangible, you can put your hands on it, or not. And then power is the ability, to get one's way. And it usually doesn't mean force, although it can. But if you are into the field of politics, then you'll understand precisely, that they get their way a lot of time, and I mean they, the ruling class, those on top, but they will mandate laws or statutes or regulations that we follow most of the time. All right, so our book continues on, and here the idea is the relationship between social structure and individuals. And let me give you a quick example. But most of us look forward to having 2 days off on what we call the weekend, and that is traditionally Saturday and Sunday. But that's really a recent invention. If you didn't know that, let me explain. About 150 years ago, people were used to working 6 days a week in factories and industrial societies that were growing, and they were used to working about 10 or 12 hours per day. But as time went on, people got tired of that, and by the 20th century, people started, so many people were complaining, and labor movements were started where workers were organized, and they proposed that no, we should only work 5 days a week, and on top of that, the workday should be reduced to 8 hours a week. And that was a radical idea at the time. But enough time went by that people, wanted that new right, that new freedom, that eventually that's exactly what happened and what we know today. And so makes you wonder kind of what will happen in the future. Maybe there will be a time in the future where there's just so much machinery going on that people don't have to work or very little at all, and they just don't go to work anymore. Wouldn't that be a strange thing to think about now, about a future in which there is no work? All right, and so here just a table that shows our three big theories, and then, for example, these components of culture, structure, and power, and how they influence each of those theories. So, again, that's a little bit kind of hard to see. I know just the three theories alone are enough, but then these added areas of culture, structure, and power make it a little bit more difficult. But if you start to look at your daily news in this type of view, that's our sociological perspective that we started with near the beginning of this recording, it'll get easier to see. Now, our book on page 23, according to the slide, it just lists some 10 features of a postmodern society. And our book really kind of does a unique way of looking at human history, and it looks at pre-modern societies, modern and postmodern. And so, really that's talking about our society today, that we're really in the digital and computer age and information-based economies. And that's to give you an idea of when they are talking about. Table 1.3 just refers to agricultural economies as pre-modern, as I mentioned a few moments ago, but just to kind of give you a good idea of what time frame they're talking about. Some of those 10 are the expansion of media and commercial culture, the threat to the natural environment, the decline of U.S. cities and the rise of suburbs, the global economy, and there's more. I'm not going to read them all, but just to give you an idea of these 10 features of postmodern societies that we're living in today. And then finally, in Chapter 1, the last thing is the challenge and hope of sociology. And primarily what that means is we're just trying to understand the connections between ourselves and the larger social world. And that's something that C. Wright Mills, who's pictured in the beginning of the chapter, tried to do during his life and his career in sociology. But really, we just want to examine all sorts of things and to move outside of our comfort zone. That doesn't mean we have to change our opinions or don't want anybody to feel forced like they have to do that. But it's just a new way of investigating. And, the point that our book is trying to do or get us to see is a better understanding. And so, there may be lots of things in the book that you don't agree with, and that's fine. But just we want to have an open mind and consideration. So I hope this helps, and I will see you the next time. Thank you very much.